Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, dim the lights, maybe grab some headphones, because we're diving into something that'll make you never take modern medicine for granted again. Before we begin, hit that like button if this is your kind of history, the dark, unfiltered kind, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable. Turn on a fan if that helps you focus. Because what happened to Jane Seymour in October 1537 isn't the fairy tale you learned in school. It's so much worse. October 12, 1537. Hampton Court Palace. A son is born. Bells explode across London. Cannons fire from the Tower. Bonfires light up the Thames. England finally has a prince. But in a sealed chamber on the second floor, Jane Seymour isn't celebrating. She can't move, can't speak, can barely breathe. The birth went wrong, catastrophically wrong. No one's telling the king yet, and in 12 days, she'll be dead. But here's what'll change everything you thought you knew about Henry VIII and his beloved wife. Jane didn't die peacefully. She died screaming. She died while infection ate through her body from the inside. She died while Henry threw parties 3 floors below her. And the worst part, she didn't have to die at all. Rewind to 1536. Anne Boleyn is running out of time. She's given Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, who he barely acknowledges. Then came the miscarriages, the stillbirths, each one a countdown clock ticking louder. Henry's already shopping, and standing in the corner of Anne's own chambers, serving her, watching her, is Jane Seymour. Nobody. Plain-faced, pale as milk, the kind of woman you'd walk past without a second glance, but she's watching everything. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, wrote this about Jane in April 1536. She is of middle stature and no great beauty, so fair that she may be called rather pale. Translation: unremarkable, which was exactly the point. Because while Anne had a sharp tongue and political opinions, Jane had perfected something more valuable: invisibility. She knew how to disappear into wallpaper, how to smile without showing teeth, how to answer questions without saying anything. Anne was fire, Jane was mist, and Henry, exhausted by fire, wanted mist. Thomas Cromwell saw the opening. He whispered in the right ears, arranged the right meetings, positioned Jane like a chess piece. On April 18, 1536, Henry sent Jane a letter with a purse of gold sovereigns. Jane sent it back. Not because she was virtuous, but because she was smart. She wrote back, and this is recorded in Chapuis's dispatches, that she could not accept gifts from the king, as she had no greater treasure in the world than her honour. Perfect. Anne would have taken the gold and made a witty comment. Catherine would have accepted it with dignity. Jane refused it with calculated modesty. Henry was obsessed. May 2nd, 1536. Anne Boleyn is arrested. Jane doesn't attend court that day. Doesn't need to, she's already won. 19 days later, Anne's head rolls off the scaffold at the Tower. The blood hasn't even dried on the straw. And the very next day, May 20th, Henry and Jane are officially betrothed. May 30th, married. 11 days after executing his wife, Henry's inside his new one. Let that sit. Jane's wearing Anne's jewels, sleeping in Anne's bed, living in Anne's apartments. Does she feel guilty? We'll never know. What we do know is this: Jane understood the game, and the only way to win was to give Henry a son. Picture Jane in those first weeks as queen. June 1536. She's been married for 2 weeks. She's lying in bed at night, alone. Henry doesn't actually sleep with his wives most nights. That's a myth. And she's doing math. Catherine. 24 years of marriage. Discarded. Anne. 3 years. Beheaded. Jane needs to get pregnant. Fast. Because the moment Henry gets bored, the moment she fails to produce, she's done. And unlike her predecessors, Jane has no illusions. She watched Catherine fade into exile, humiliated and abandoned. She watched Anne go from beloved to arrested to dead in 3 weeks. Jane knows exactly what happens to wives who disappoint. So she tries, month after month, nothing. and Henry's getting impatient. He always does. Court gossips start whispering. Maybe she's barren. Maybe God's punishing Henry again. Maybe the king should start looking elsewhere. Jane feels the pressure, like a physical weight on her chest, because every month she doesn't conceive is a month closer to being replaced. Then early 1537, pregnant, the court exhales. Henry's mood lifts. He calls her his true wife, praises her modesty, her virtue. But Jane knows the truth. He doesn't love her. He loves the possibility growing inside her. She's not a person. She's a vessel. And if that vessel cracks, if she miscarries, if she delivers a daughter, if anything goes wrong, well, we've already established what happens to failed vessels. As the pregnancy progresses, they move Jane to Hampton Court. Seclusion, isolation. This is standard for royal pregnancies. The idea: keep the Queen calm, quiet, undisturbed. Preserve her strength for the ordeal ahead. But there's another reason for the isolation. If something goes wrong, if the baby dies, if Jane miscarries, it can be hidden, managed, controlled, because the realm needs good news. And Jane? She's just the delivery system. By October, Jane is massive, swollen, uncomfortable, terrified. The physicians examine her regularly. They palpate her belly with unwashed hands, trying to determine the baby's position. No one knows about bacteria yet, about infection, about basic hygiene. They just touch her. And with every examination, they're introducing microbes into her body, planting the seeds of her death. But Jane doesn't know that. All she knows is, soon. Soon she'll either be a success or a failure. Soon she'll either secure her position or join Catherine and Anne. Soon. October 9th, 1537. Labour begins. They move Jane to the birthing chamber, a room that's been sealed, prepared, transformed into what's essentially a ritual space. Heavy tapestries cover every wall, blocking drafts. Curtains are drawn across the windows. The air inside is thick, hot, stagnant. No fresh air, no light, just candlelight and incense and the smell of nervous women. This is protocol. Royal women give birth in darkness, attended only by female midwives and servants. No men allowed, unless things go catastrophically wrong. The head midwife's name was lost to history, but we know she was experienced, trusted, expensive, which means nothing. Because in 1537, even the best midwife is working blind. No understanding of anatomy, no concept of infection, no training beyond apprenticeship and superstition. The contractions start mild. Jane walks, she squats. She grips the birthing chair, a specially designed seat with a hole in the bottom. Hours pass, the contractions intensify. Jane is sweating. The room is sweltering. The fire roars in the hearth because Tudor medicine insists heat helps labour. In reality, it's creating a bacterial incubator. Day 1 becomes day 2. The baby isn't descending. The midwives check Jane, fingers reaching inside, feeling for the baby's head. Unwashed fingers. Jane is exhausted. She hasn't slept, hasn't eaten much. Her body is screaming. And Edward, he's stuck. Here's what's happening inside Jane's body. Edward is large. Jane's pelvis is small. The angle is wrong. In 2024, this is a C-section, routine. 20 minutes, mother and baby go home in 2 days. In 1537, this is a nightmare, because a caesarean section in Tudor England means death, always, for the mother. They only perform it when the mother has already died to try to save the baby. So the physicians have a choice. Let Jane labour until her uterus ruptures and she bleeds to death. Or intervene, forceps, hooks, manual manipulation, and risk tearing her apart. October 11th, day 3 of labour. Jane is delirious now. The pain is beyond description. She's screaming. They give her wine, a leather strap to bite. Prayers, that's it. No morphine, no epidural, no relief. Just pain. Raw, animal, endless. The physicians are finally called in. This is bad. The midwives have admitted defeat. Dr. William Butts, Henry's personal physician, examines Jane. He confers with his colleagues in hushed tones. Then someone is sent to the king. We don't have the exact words of this conversation, but we have what happened next. The physicians return with instructions. Save the baby, whatever it takes. And there's an account, possibly apocryphal, probably based in truth, that Henry said, if it comes to choosing, save the boy. We can always get another wife. Did he say those exact words? Maybe not, but his actions said them loud enough. October 12th, morning. The physicians bring out the instruments, iron forceps, crude, heavy, designed to grip a baby's skull, and pull, no anesthesia. Jane is awake for all of this. They reach inside her, metal scraping against flesh. Jane is screaming, begging them to stop. They don't. They grip Edward's head, and they pull. The tearing is catastrophic. Tissue rips, blood pours, but Edward comes free, alive, and that's all that matters. The physicians hand him to a waiting midwife. She cleans him, wraps him. Edward, future King of England, lets out his first cry. The physicians turn back to Jane. She's hemorrhaging, blood pooling beneath her. They pack her with cloths, stitch what they can, rough, uneven stitches done without painkillers. Jane passes out. When she wakes, Edward is gone, already being presented to Henry, already being celebrated, and Jane is left alone in that blood-soaked room. The infection has already begun. Let's pause here and talk about what's happening inside Jane's body right now, because this is where Jane dies, not in the birth, in the aftermath. Her uterus is essentially an open wound, the placenta detached, leaving raw, exposed tissue. In a healthy delivery, with proper hygiene, this heals naturally within a week. But Jane didn't have a healthy delivery. She had a traumatic, obstructed labour with multiple internal examinations and instrumental delivery. Every time the midwives checked her, unwashed hands. Every time they reached inside, contamination. The instruments used to deliver Edward? Not sterilised, probably used on another woman earlier that week. The cloths they used to pack Jane's hemorrhage? Washed in cold water if at all. Bacteria is everywhere, and now it's inside Jane. Group A streptococcus most likely, the same bacteria that causes strep throat. But in Jane's uterus, it's deadly. It colonises the wounded tissue, multiplies, starts producing toxins. Within 24 hours, symptoms begin. October 13th, 1537. London is celebrating. Bonfires in the streets, bells ringing, the Tower guns firing salutes. Henry orders a Te Deum, a Thanksgiving service, in every church across England. At Hampton Court there's a feast, music, dancing. Henry is euphoric. In Jane's chamber, she's developing a fever. It's mild at first, easy to dismiss. Post-birth exhaustion, her attendants think. They give her wine, broth, tell her to rest. The fever climbs. October 14th, Henry hosts another celebration, this one even grander. He's already drafting letters to foreign courts, announcing Edward's birth. Divine Providence has granted us a prince, he writes to Francis of France. No mention of Jane. In her chamber, the fever is spiking now. 101, 102 degrees. Jane is shaking with chills, even though the room is sweltering. The infection is spreading through her uterine lining. Her attendants notice. They report it to the physicians. Dr. Butts examines Jane, presses on her abdomen. Jane cries out. The pain is sharp, stabbing. He notes, some concern in his records. That's it, some concern. Not urgent action, not a desperate attempt to find out what's wrong. Just concern. October 15th. The fever hits 103. Jane is sweating through her linens. They have to change them twice a day. Her abdomen is swollen, tender, hot to the touch. The infection has spread beyond her uterus now. It's in her bloodstream. Septicemia. The physicians try bloodletting. They open a vein in Jane's arm, drain a bowl of blood. The theory, remove the bad humours causing the fever. The reality, Jane is already weak from blood loss during delivery. Taking more blood just weakens her further. It doesn't help. It never helps. October 16th. Jane is delirious now. The fever is cooking her brain. She drifts in and out of consciousness. When she's awake, she's in agony. Her abdomen feels like it's burning from the inside. When she's unconscious, she's having fever dreams, nightmares. Her attendants are frightened now. One of them, we don't know her name, writes in a letter, preserved in state papers. The Queen is in great distress. She knows not where she is. Henry is informed. His response? Order more prayers, not more doctors, not urgent consultations, not experimental treatments, just prayers. Because if Jane dies, it's God's will, and if she lives, it's God's mercy. Either way, Henry is absolved. October 17th. The infection is systemic now. It's everywhere. Blood, organs, tissue. Jane's kidneys are starting to fail. Her urine is dark, scanty. Her heart is struggling, racing to keep up with the infection. Her breathing is shallow, rapid. Jane is dying. Everyone knows it. But there's something scheduled for tomorrow. Something important. Edward's christening. And Jane needs to be there. October 18th, 1537. 3 days after the infection took hold. 6 days after the traumatic delivery. Jane is barely conscious. But the christening must proceed, and the Queen must attend. So they move her. Her attendants lift Jane onto a litter, a portable bed carried by 4 men. She cries out. Every movement is agony. They carry her through the palace corridors to an observation room adjacent to the Chapel Royal. Jane is propped up against pillows so she can witness the ceremony. Can she see? Can she understand what's happening? Probably not. She's feverish, delirious, septic. But she's there, because appearances matter more than her suffering. The christening is elaborate. Princess Mary, Jane's stepdaughter, Catherine's daughter, is Edward's godmother. Princess Elizabeth, 2 years old, Anne's daughter, carries the christening robe. The entire court attends, nobles, clergy, ambassadors. Henry stands at the front, beaming with pride. And Jane, his wife, the woman who nearly died to give him this moment, she's a prop in an observation room, barely alive. After the ceremony ends, they carry Jane back to her chamber. She collapses. The exertion has made everything worse. Her fever spikes even higher. October 19th. Jane is unconscious more than she's awake now. Her pulse is weak, thready. Her skin is cold despite the fever. Her lips are blue. These are signs of septic shock. Her body is shutting down. Organs are failing. Her blood pressure has dropped so low that her extremities aren't getting oxygen. Jane is dying. Henry does not visit. October 20th. Same. October 21st. One of Jane's attendants, Lady Rutland, we think, makes a decision. She brings Edward to Jane. Jane hasn't seen him since the birth. 9 days ago. Lady Rutland places him in Jane's arms. Does Jane recognise him? Does she understand what she's holding? For a moment, maybe, she's lucid. She looks at his face, touches his cheek. Then the fever pulls her back under. Edward is taken away. Jane never sees him again. October 22nd. Jane's breathing changes. It's called agonal breathing, irregular, gasping, a sign that the body is in its final stages. Her attendants send word to Henry. Finally, he comes. Henry VIII enters Jane's chamber, sometime after midnight on October 23rd. What does he see? Jane skeletal and pale, drenched in sweat. Her breathing ragged, her eyes unfocused. The room reeks of sickness, of death. Does he feel guilt? Does he realise that his obsession with a son has killed her? We don't know. What we know is he stays for a few minutes, then he leaves. He doesn't stay with Jane as she dies. He doesn't hold her hand. He doesn't whisper comfort. He just leaves. At approximately 2 a.m. on October 24th, 1537, 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour dies. She's 28 years old. Her body, ravaged by infection, finally gives out. Septic shock, multiple organ failure, preventable, if her doctors had washed their hands, if the birthing chamber had been properly ventilated, if she'd been allowed to rest instead of being forced to attend a christening, if Henry had cared enough to fight for her life, instead of just celebrating her son. If. But none of those things happened. So Jane died, alone, in agony, discarded. When news reaches Henry, he weeps, publicly, dramatically. He declares himself heartbroken, orders the court into mourning, commissions artists to paint Jane's portrait posthumously, calls her his beloved wife, his true love. But here's what he does next. Within 3 months, he's looking for wife number 4. Portraits are being collected, envoys sent to foreign courts. The mourning period isn't even over, because Henry's grief has a shelf life, and that shelf life is determined by political necessity. England needs alliances, Henry needs heirs, Edward is sickly, one son isn't enough. So the search begins. Jane is dead. Long live the next queen. Let me tell you about a woman named Ignaz Semmelweis. Wait, no, Ignaz was a man, but his discovery could have saved Jane Seymour. Vienna General Hospital. Dr. Semmelweis is working in the maternity ward, and he notices something disturbing. Women who give birth attended by physicians die at rates of 10 to 35%. Women who give birth attended by midwives die at rates of 2 to 3%. Why? Semmelweis investigates, and he discovers something horrifying. The physicians are performing autopsies in the morning, dissecting corpses, handling diseased organs. Then they're delivering babies in the afternoon, without washing their hands. They're literally transferring death from the morgue to the maternity ward. Semmelweis is horrified. He mandates a new policy. Wash your hands with chlorinated lime solution between patients. Mortality rates plummet overnight. He's solved it. Figured out that childbed fever, puerperal fever, the infection that killed Jane, is caused by contamination. But when he publishes his findings, the medical establishment destroys him. Other doctors are offended by the suggestion that they're killing their patients. A gentleman's hands are always clean, one prominent surgeon declares. Semmelweis is mocked, ridiculed, called obsessive, paranoid. He grows increasingly desperate, increasingly angry. He writes letters accusing doctors of murder. He's not wrong, but he's not polite about it. In 1865, colleagues trick him into visiting a mental asylum. Once inside, they commit him. Semmelweis dies 2 weeks later, probably beaten by guards. He's 47. It takes another 20 years, decades, for his ideas to be accepted. By then, tens of thousands more women have died, including Jane Seymour 310 years earlier, because doctors' egos were more important than women's lives. Picture Jane's death chamber, October 23rd, late at night. She's lying in that bed, barely conscious. The fever has her in its grip, but for just a moment, she's lucid, and she can hear it, through the floor, through the walls, music, laughter, the sounds of celebration. Henry is hosting another feast, another celebration of Edward's birth, while Jane dies 3 floors above him. Can she hear it? The musicians playing, the courtiers dancing, the sound of Henry's booming laugh. They're celebrating the son she gave them, the son that's killing her, and nobody's coming. Nobody's checking on her. Nobody's holding her hand. She's alone, and she knows that she's going to die, that this fever won't break, that her body won't heal, that in a few hours she'll be gone. And Henry will mourn for exactly as long as protocol requires. Then he'll move on, find another wife, another womb, another woman to use up and discard. Does Jane want to scream, want to rage, want to tell them all that this isn't fair, that she did everything right, that she gave them what they wanted, and it's still not enough? Probably. But she doesn't have the strength, so she lies there, listening to them celebrate her son, while she dies, alone. November 12, 1537, Jane's funeral. It's held at Windsor Castle, St. George's Chapel. Grand, elaborate, expensive. Henry walks behind Jane's coffin, dressed in black, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. He's performing grief, and everyone knows it. Jane's body has been eviscerated, organs removed to slow decomposition, and placed in a lead-lined coffin. She's buried in the vault beneath the chapel floor. Years later, when Henry dies, he'll be buried beside her. Not Catherine, not Anne, Jane, the wife who gave him a son, because that's all Jane ever was to him. Not a person, not a partner, a womb, and now a tomb ornament. But let's rewind. Let's go back to who Jane was before Henry, before the crown, before the death sentence of becoming queen. Jane Seymour was born around 1508 at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, England. The Seymours weren't nobility. They were gentry, respectable, connected, but unremarkable. Jane's father, Sir John Seymour, was a courtier. Her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, had slightly better bloodlines, descended from Edward III, though distantly enough that it didn't matter much. They had 10 children. Jane was somewhere in the middle, not the eldest son who'd inherit, not the youngest child who'd be doted on. Just Jane, middle daughter, easy to overlook. And that's exactly what happened. Contemporary descriptions of young Jane are sparse. The ones we have aren't flattering. Of middle stature and no great beauty, pale as a ghost, so fair she may be called rather pale. Translation. Jane was plain, unremarkable, the kind of girl who blended into backgrounds. But Jane had something more valuable than beauty in Tudor England. She knew how to behave. Her education was typical for a gentry woman: basic reading and writing, needlework, household management, music, dancing. Nothing intellectual, nothing that would make her opinionated or difficult. Jane was trained from childhood to be one thing: an acceptable wife, quiet, obedient, modest, invisible when necessary, and she was good at it. Really good. In her late teens or early 20s, Jane was sent to court as a lady-in-waiting, first to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, then after Catherine was cast aside, to Anne Boleyn. Think about that for a moment. Jane served both of the women Henry would destroy to get to her. She watched Catherine be humiliated, divorced, exiled. She watched Anne rise to power through charm and sexuality, then fall through fabricated charges. Jane was there for all of it, watching, learning, and when her moment came, when Henry's eyes turned toward her in early 1536, Jane knew exactly what to do. Be the opposite of Anne. Anne was witty, be demure. Anne had opinions, be silent. Anne was sexual, be modest. Anne challenged Henry, agree with everything. It wasn't complicated. Jane had watched 2 queens fall. She knew the pattern, and she was determined not to repeat their mistakes. But here's where Jane's story gets interesting. She wasn't just a passive victim. She wasn't just a pawn moved by men. Jane made choices. When Henry sent her that purse of gold sovereigns in April 1536, Jane could have accepted it. Most women would have. Instead, she sent it back with a carefully worded message about her honour. That was calculated. Jane understood that Henry was tired of women who wanted his money, his favour, his attention. He wanted a woman who seemed above such things. So Jane played that role. When Anne Boleyn was arrested on May 1536, Jane could have expressed sympathy, could have shown shock. Instead, she accepted Anne's jewels and chambers without apparent hesitation. Cold? Absolutely. But also survival. Because in Tudor England, especially at Henry's court, sentiment got you killed. Pragmatism kept you alive. Jane wasn't naive, wasn't innocent. She was a woman playing a deadly game with the only tools she had: compliance, modesty, and strategic silence. Did she feel guilty about stepping into Anne's still warm place? Maybe. Or maybe she felt relief that it was Anne in the tower and not her. We'll never know. What we do know is Jane married Henry 11 days after Anne's execution, and she did it willingly. Here's something that'll make Jane's story even darker. She knew what she was getting into. She'd watched it happen twice. Catherine, discarded after 24 years. Anne, executed after 3. Jane knew that marrying Henry was dangerous, that pregnancy was Russian roulette, that failing to produce a son was potentially fatal, and she did it anyway. Why? Because she didn't really have a choice. Her family pushed her forward. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, positioned her perfectly. Henry selected her. Jane was a pawn in a political game played by men who saw her as a useful tool. But here's the thing, Jane tried to survive anyway. She calculated every move, said the right things, smiled at the right moments, played the role of the perfect obedient wife. Because she genuinely believed that if she did everything right, she'd be safe. If she was modest enough, quiet enough, compliant enough, she'd be the one Henry kept. If she gave him a son, she'd be secure, protected, maybe even loved. But she wasn't, because Henry didn't want a wife, he wanted a womb. And once Jane had served that purpose, her continued existence became irrelevant. Her compliance didn't save her. Her obedience didn't protect her. She did everything right, and it killed her anyway. Let's talk about Jane's pregnancy in more detail, because those 9 months were their own form of torture. Early 1537, Jane conceives, finally. The court is relieved, Henry is pleased, but Jane is terrified, because now the real test begins. She needs to carry this baby to term, needs it to be healthy, needs it to be a boy. 3 requirements, each one a potential death sentence. Miscarriage was common in Tudor England. Maybe 20 to 30% of pregnancies ended in miscarriage. And if Jane miscarried, especially if it happened more than once, she'd be following in Anne Boleyn's footsteps, straight to the executioner's block. So Jane is moved to Hampton Court, isolated, restricted. This is standard protocol for royal pregnancies. Keep the Queen calm, quiet, undisturbed. No stress, no excitement, no bad news. But this isolation is also psychological torture. Jane spends 9 months essentially imprisoned in her chambers. No freedom, no privacy, constant monitoring, every symptom analysed, every cramp reported, every change in her body scrutinised by physicians who know nothing about obstetrics. And through it all, Jane knows, if this goes wrong, she's done. As the pregnancy progresses, the pressure intensifies. Court astrologers predict the baby's sex. They predict a boy, of course. Predicting a girl would be politically stupid. Preparations begin for a male heir. Nurseries prepared, ceremonies planned, announcements drafted. All assuming Jane will deliver a healthy son. If she doesn't, no backup plan, just failure. By September, Jane is huge, uncomfortable, frightened. She goes into confinement, the final stage of royal pregnancy, where she's completely isolated from the outside world. The birthing chamber is prepared, sealed, darkened, filled with female attendants. Jane will stay in this room until the baby is born, whether that takes days or weeks. And then October 9th, labour begins. Let's get visceral about the birth itself, because the sanitised version doesn't capture the horror. Day 1, October 9th. Contractions start in the evening. Mild at first. Jane walks around the birthing chamber, leaning on her attendants when the pain intensifies. This is normal, expected. The midwives are calm. They've done this dozens of times. By midnight, the contractions are stronger, coming every few minutes. Jane is instructed to sit on the birthing chair, a specially designed seat with a hole in the bottom, positioned so the baby can drop through. Gravity-assisted birth. The theory is sound, but Edward isn't descending. Day 2, October 10th. Dawn breaks. Jane has been in labour for 8 hours. She's exhausted, hasn't slept, can barely eat. The contractions are intense now, painful, but the baby hasn't moved. The midwives examine Jane, fingers reaching inside, feeling for the baby's position. Edward is head down. That's good, but he's not moving into the birth canal. The midwives try to manually reposition him, try to create more space. Jane screams, more examinations, more manipulation, more bacteria introduced with every unwashed hand. By evening of day 2, the midwives are concerned. This is taking too long. Day 3, October 11th. Jane has been in active labour for 48 hours. She's delirious with pain and exhaustion. The contractions are constant now, no break between them. Jane is begging for it to stop, crying, screaming. They give her wine, tell her to pray, tell her to push harder. But Edward won't come. The midwives confer in hushed voices. This is obstructed labour. The baby is stuck. Without intervention, both mother and child will die. The physicians are summoned. Dr. William Butts arrives with his colleagues. They examine Jane, who at this point is barely conscious, and confirm what the midwives already know. The baby is too large. Jane's pelvis is too small. This isn't going to resolve naturally. They have options, all of them bad. Option 1, wait. Hope the contractions eventually force the baby through. Risk, uterine rupture, hemorrhage, death for both mother and child. Option 2, perform a craniotomy. Use hooks to crush the baby's skull and remove it piece by piece. This saves the mother, but kills the baby. Option 3, use forceps and manual traction to pull the baby out. Risk, severe tearing for the mother, potential death from hemorrhage or infection. Option 4, caesarean section. This definitely kills the mother and might save the baby. The physicians send word to Henry. What should we do? Henry's answer is clear. Save the baby, whatever it takes. So the physicians choose option 3. They're going to pull Edward out. The forceps are brought in. Iron, heavy, designed to grip a baby's skull without crushing it. No one has explained to Jane what's about to happen. She's too far gone to understand anyway. The physicians position themselves. 2 of them hold Jane down. She's thrashing, trying to escape the pain. A third reaches inside with the forceps, metal scraping against tissue. He finds Edward's head, clamps the forceps around it, and pulls. Jane's scream is described in one account as inhuman. The physician pulls harder. Tissue tears. Blood flows. Jane passes out. The physician keeps pulling. Finally, Edward's head emerges. Then his shoulders, his body. October 12th, 1537, sometime around noon, Edward is born. He's alive, breathing, crying. The midwives clean him, wrap him, present him to the waiting courtiers. England has a prince. Meanwhile, Jane is hemorrhaging. Blood is pouring from the massive tears in her perineum and vaginal wall. The physicians pack her with cloths, stitch what they can. But the damage is catastrophic. Her uterus is torn. Her cervix is lacerated. Internal tissue is shredded. And every surface is now exposed to bacteria. Jane wakes briefly, asks what happened. Someone tells her, "Your Grace has given the king a son." Jane nods, then passes out again. Edward is taken to meet Henry. Jane is left alone in the blood-soaked room. The infection begins immediately. Here's what the physicians should have noticed. October 13th. Jane has a fever. Low grade, but present. This is a red flag. Post-birth fever indicates infection. They should have been alarmed. Instead, they dismissed it as normal post-labour exhaustion. October 14th. The fever spikes to 101, then 102. Jane is sweating, shaking with chills. These are classic signs of infection. The physicians note it. Do nothing. October 15th. Fever hits 103. Jane's abdomen is swollen, tender, hot. She's crying out in pain when they examine her. Her vaginal discharge smells foul. Another sign of infection. The physicians try bloodletting. It does nothing. October 16th. Jane is delirious. The fever is cooking her brain. She doesn't recognize her attendants, doesn't know where she is. Her pulse is rapid, her breathing shallow. These are signs of sepsis, systemic infection. But the physicians don't understand sepsis, won't understand it for another 200 years. They just keep praying. October 17th. Jane's kidneys are failing. Her urine is dark, scanty. Her lips are turning blue, a sign her organs aren't getting enough oxygen. She's in septic shock. Without modern medicine, she has days left, maybe hours. And still, Henry doesn't visit. October 18th. Edward's christening. This is where the cruelty becomes stark. Jane is dying. Everyone knows it. But the christening has been planned. invitations sent, ceremonies arranged, and the Queen must attend. So they move her. 4 men lift Jane's litter. She moans. Every movement is agony. They carry her through the corridors of Hampton Court to the observation room. Jane is propped against pillows, positioned so she can witness the ceremony through an open doorway. Can she see? Can she understand? Doubtful. She's feverish, septic, barely conscious, but she's there, because the optics matter. The court needs to see that the Queen is present for her son's christening, that everything is normal, that Jane is recovering, even though everyone in that room knows she's dying. The ceremony is elaborate. The Archbishop of Canterbury presides. Princess Mary stands as godmother. Henry is radiant, proud, finally vindicated after years of disappointments. And Jane, 3 floors above him, slips further toward death. After the ceremony, they carry Jane back to her chamber. The exertion has drained what little strength she had left. Her fever spikes to 105. She has 4 days left. Let's talk about what those final days looked like, because dying of infection sounds clinical. The reality is brutal. October 19th. Jane is barely conscious. She drifts in and out of fever dreams. When she's awake, the pain is unbearable. Her abdomen feels like it's on fire. The infection has spread throughout her uterus, into her bloodstream, into her organs. Her body is trying to fight it. That's what the fever is, an immune response, but it's losing. Jane's attendants try to keep her comfortable. They give her wine, change her sweat-soaked linens, wipe her face with cool cloths. It does nothing. Jane vomits. She can't keep anything down. Her pulse is weak, rapid. October 20th. Jane's breathing changes. It becomes rapid, shallow. Her skin is cold despite the fever. Her lips are blue. These are signs that her organs are shutting down. Her heart is struggling. Her lungs are filling with fluid. Her kidneys have stopped functioning. Toxins are building up in her blood. Jane slips into a semi-comatose state. She responds to voices but doesn't seem to understand them. Her attendants are terrified. They've seen this before. Women dying slowly from childbed fever. There's nothing they can do. October 24th. Lady Rutland makes a decision. Jane hasn't seen Edward since the birth, 12 days ago. Lady Rutland brings him to Jane's chamber. She places the baby in Jane's arms. For a brief moment, Jane seems to focus. She looks at Edward's face, touches his cheek with a trembling hand. Does she understand that this is her son? That this is the child she's dying for? Maybe, for just a moment. Then the fever pulls her back under. Edward is removed. Jane never sees him again. October 22nd. Jane's breathing becomes agonal, irregular gasps, a sign that death is imminent. Her pulse is barely palpable. Her skin is mottled grey. She's dying. Finally, someone sends word to Henry. The king is summoned to his wife's deathbed. Henry arrives after midnight. He enters Jane's chamber and sees his wife, skeletal and pale, barely breathing. Her eyes are open but unseeing. The room smells of sickness, death, decay. Does Henry feel anything? Guilt, regret, sorrow? We don't know. What we know is he stays for a few minutes. Then he leaves. He doesn't stay with Jane as she dies, doesn't hold her hand, doesn't offer comfort. He just walks out. A few hours later, at approximately 2 a.m. on October 24th, 1537, Jane Seymour dies. She is 28 years old. Her body, destroyed by infection, finally gives up. The cause, puerperal sepsis. Infection of the uterus spreading to systemic sepsis and multiple organ failure. The real cause, medical negligence. Unwashed hands, contaminated instruments, prioritizing the baby over the mother. Jane's death was preventable. Completely, entirely preventable. But nobody cared enough to prevent it. When Henry is informed of Jane's death, he weeps. According to accounts, he's greatly grieved. He orders the court into mourning. Black clothing, cancelled festivities. He commissions a portrait of Jane to be painted posthumously. she'll be depicted as serene, beautiful, eternal. Nothing like the skeletal, sweat-soaked woman who died screaming. Henry declares that Jane was his true wife, his beloved, the only woman who truly understood him. It's a beautiful story. It's also a lie, because if Henry had truly loved Jane, he would have saved her. He had the power, the resources, the best physicians in England. But he didn't use them to help Jane. He used them to deliver Edward. Once Edward was born, Jane became expendable. Her continued existence was unnecessary, so Henry let her die. Not through active malice. Henry probably didn't want Jane to die, but through indifference, through prioritizing his needs over hers, through seeing her as a vessel first and a person, well, probably never. 3 months after Jane dies, Henry's looking for wife number 4. 3 months. The mourning period isn't even over, but England needs alliances. Henry needs more heirs. Edward is sickly. 1 son isn't enough, so the search begins. Ambassadors are sent to foreign courts. Portraits are commissioned. Eligible noblewomen across Europe are evaluated like livestock. Age, childbearing potential, political connections, dowry. Henry's grief has an expiration date, and that date is determined by political necessity, not emotional attachment. Jane is barely cold in her tomb, and Henry's already shopping for her replacement. By 1540, he'll marry Anne of Cleves and divorce her 6 months later when he finds her unattractive. By 1540, he'll marry Catherine Howard and execute her 2 years later for adultery. By 1543, he'll marry Catherine Parr, who'll survive him barely. 6 wives total. Jane is number 3, the one who succeeded by dying after giving him a son, the one Henry claimed to love most, the one he's buried beside. But here's the truth. Henry didn't love Jane. He loved what she represented: validation, success, a son. And once she'd provided that, her value was spent. Now let's talk about Edward, the boy Jane died for. Edward VI was born October 12, 1537. He became king at age 9 when Henry died in 1547, and he ruled for exactly 6 years. Because Edward was always sickly. From birth he was frail, pale, prone to illness, chronic respiratory infections, persistent coughs, weakness. Historians have debated why. Some think the traumatic birth, the prolonged labour, the forceps delivery, caused brain damage or other complications. Others suggest congenital syphilis inherited from Henry, who probably contracted it years earlier. Still others point to tuberculosis, which Edward almost certainly had by the end of his life. Whatever the cause, Edward was never healthy. He was intellectually brilliant, well-educated, fluent in Latin and Greek, interested in theology and politics. But physically, he was a ghost, pale, thin, weak. In 1553, at age 15, Edward died. Probably tuberculosis, possibly pneumonia. Definitely the same fragile constitution that had plagued him since birth. So Jane's sacrifice, her suffering, her agonizing death, bought England a boy king who lived to 15. 15 years. That's all. All that pain, all that blood, all that death, for a sickly child who never reached adulthood. And after Edward died, the throne went to Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. The girl Henry tried so hard to bastardize, to erase, to disinherit. She ruled for 5 years before dying childless. And after Mary came Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child Henry barely acknowledged, the daughter he dismissed. Elizabeth the Fiancée, who became England's greatest monarch. 45 years of rule. The Elizabethan Golden Age. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Shakespeare. Global exploration. Religious settlement. All from the daughter Henry thought was worthless. So in the end, Henry's obsession with male heirs was pointless. The women he destroyed, the wives he sacrificed, the daughters he rejected, their children inherited his throne. And they did a better job than his son ever could have. It's almost poetic, except for Jane, because Jane died believing Edward would be great. that her sacrifice mattered, but Edward barely made it to adolescence, and England's future wasn't secured by the son Jane died for. It was secured by the daughters Henry tried to erase. Let's talk about the other women who died the same way. Because Jane wasn't unique. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. She survived Henry, outlived him even. Smart, politically savvy, lucky. After Henry died in 1547, Catherine remarried quickly to Thomas Seymour, Edward's uncle. Within a year, she was pregnant. September 5th, 1548, Catherine gives birth to a daughter, Mary. September 7th, 1548, Catherine develops a fever. Puerperal fever. September 11th, 1548, Catherine Parr dies. 4 days. That's how long it took. The same infection that killed Jane killed Catherine. Same symptoms, same progression, same death. She was 36 years old. Catherine of Aragon's mother, Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. The queen who funded Columbus. She had 5 children. Multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Each pregnancy risked death. The repeated childbirths destroyed Isabella's health. She died at 53, her body wrecked from years of pregnancy and childbirth. Anne Boleyn, she miscarried at least twice, maybe 3 times. Each miscarriage carried risks: hemorrhage, infection, death. Anne survived the pregnancies, but Henry had her executed anyway. Mary I, Catherine's daughter, Jane's stepdaughter. Mary had 2 phantom pregnancies. She showed every symptom: swollen belly, missed periods, nausea, even breast changes. She prepared birthing chambers, announced due dates to foreign ambassadors, and then nothing. No baby, no labour, just humiliation. Modern doctors think it was ovarian cysts or possibly uterine cancer, but Mary believed she was pregnant. The pressure to produce an heir was so intense that Mary's body manifested false pregnancy symptoms. Twice, can you imagine? The psychological torture of that? Believing you're pregnant, preparing for a child, only to realise, months later, that there's nothing there? These women, Jane, Catherine, Anne, Mary, Isabella, weren't just historical figures. They were real people who lived under impossible pressure, who suffered real physical and psychological trauma, whose bodies were treated as political assets, not as human, and who died, or nearly died, or wished they had died, because their worth was measured entirely by their ability to produce male heirs. Here's a detail that'll haunt you. After Jane died, they embalmed her. Tudor embalming meant evisceration. They cut Jane open, abdomen to sternum, removed her internal organs, heart, lungs, liver, intestines, stomach. These organs were placed in a lead casket and buried separately. Jane's corpse was then washed, wrapped in cerecloth, waxed linen, and placed in her coffin. Why? To preserve her body long enough for the funeral, which would take 3 weeks to organise. But here's the thing, Jane didn't need to be preserved that long. She could have been buried within days, but the funeral needed to be grand, elaborate, a spectacle, a demonstration of Henry's grief. So Jane's body was gutted and put on display. For 3 weeks, her lead-lined coffin sat in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. Courtiers filed past, masses were held, candles burned constantly. Henry attended some of these services, wept publicly, played the grieving widower, but in private. In private, he was already writing to foreign courts about potential brides. Jane's body wasn't even buried yet, and Henry was shopping. November 12th, 1537. Jane's funeral. The coffin is carried from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle, about 20 miles. The entire court follows. Hundreds of people dressed in black. Henry walks behind the coffin, head bowed, handkerchief in hand. The performance of grief. At Windsor, they bury Jane in St George's Chapel. The Archbishop of Canterbury presides. The ceremony is elaborate, expensive. Princess Mary, Jane's stepdaughter, now 21, is chief mourner. She's already buried her mother, Catherine. Now she's burying her stepmother. How many more of her father's wives will she bury? After the funeral, there's a feast, because even death is an opportunity for Henry to display his wealth and power. They eat, drink, toast Jane's memory, and then they go home. Life continues without Jane. Henry declared that when he died, he wanted to be buried beside Jane, and in 1547, when Henry finally died, obese, diseased, probably syphilitic, they buried him next to her. His coffin was placed beside Jane's in the vault beneath St. George's Chapel. For eternity, he claimed her. Even in death, Jane couldn't escape him. In 1888, during renovations at Windsor, workers discovered the vault. They opened it. Inside, 2 lead coffins, side by side. They opened Jane's. Inside, skeletal remains, fragments of cerecloth, a few strands of hair. That's all that was left of Jane Seymour. Bones and dust, 351 years after her death. They resealed the vault. Jane is still there now, still beside Henry, the man who let her die. Here's what I want you to understand. Jane knew what she was getting into. She'd watched Catherine be destroyed. She'd watched Anne be executed. She knew marrying Henry was dangerous, that pregnancy was Russian roulette, that failing to produce a son could be fatal. And she did it anyway. Not because she was stupid, but because she didn't have a choice. Her family pushed her forward. Thomas Cromwell positioned her. Henry selected her. Jane was a pawn in a political game played by powerful men. But here's what I think. I think Jane tried to survive. I think she calculated every move, said the right things, smiled at the right moments, played the perfect, obedient wife, because she genuinely believed that if she did everything right, she'd be safe. If she was modest enough, quiet enough, compliant enough, Henry would keep her. If she gave him a son, she'd be secure, protected, maybe even loved. But she wasn't, because Henry didn't want a wife. He wanted a womb. And once Jane had served that purpose, her continued existence was irrelevant. Her compliance didn't save her. Her obedience didn't protect her. She did everything right, and it killed her. Let's talk about the medical realities one more time, because understanding exactly what killed Jane makes the negligence even clearer. Puerperal fever, the infection that killed Jane, is caused by bacteria entering the uterus during or after childbirth. Usually, group A Streptococcus, sometimes Staphylococcus, occasionally other bacteria. It doesn't matter which, the result is the same. The bacteria colonize the raw tissue where the placenta detached. They multiply exponentially. Within 24-48 hours, the infection spreads through the uterine lining. Symptoms appear: fever, chills, abdominal pain, foul-smelling discharge. If untreated, and in 1537 there was no treatment, the infection breaches the uterine wall. It enters the bloodstream. This is septicemia, bacteria in the blood. The bacteria travel throughout the body: heart, lungs, kidneys, brain, liver. The immune system goes into overdrive, triggering a massive inflammatory response. This is SIRS, Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. Blood vessels start leaking. Fluid seeps into tissues. Blood pressure drops. The heart races 120, 140, 160 beats per minute, trying to compensate. But it's not enough. Organs aren't getting enough oxygen. The kidneys fail first, urine stops, toxins accumulate. Then the lungs. They fill with fluid. Breathing becomes laboured. Then the heart. It simply can't keep up anymore. Finally, the brain. Starved of oxygen, it shuts down. The patient slips into a coma and dies. This is what happened to Jane over 12 days. Slow, agonising, entirely preventable. All it would have taken was clean hands, sterilised instruments, proper ventilation in the birthing chamber, minimising internal examinations, and allowing Jane to rest after delivery instead of forcing her to attend a christening. That's it, basic hygiene and common sense, but nobody cared enough to implement it, because Jane was a woman, and women died in childbirth all the time. It was expected, normal, unremarkable, even when the woman was queen. Here's something that'll make you furious. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis figured out how to prevent puerperal fever in 1847, just 310 years too late for Jane. Semmelweis worked at Vienna General Hospital. He noticed that women who gave birth in the physician-staffed ward died at rates of 10–35%. Women who gave birth in the midwife-staffed ward died at rates of 2–3%. Why? Semmelweis investigated, and he discovered something horrifying. The physicians were performing autopsies in the morning, dissecting corpses, handling diseased tissue. Then they were delivering babies in the afternoon, without washing their hands. They were literally transferring death from corpses to living women. Semmelweis was horrified. He mandated hand washing with chlorinated lime solution between patients. Mortality rates plummeted. Problem solved, right? Wrong. When Semmelweis published his findings, the medical establishment destroyed him. Other doctors were offended by the suggestion that they were killing their patients. "A gentleman's hands are always clean," one prominent surgeon declared. Semmelweis grew increasingly desperate, increasingly angry. He wrote letters accusing doctors of murder. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't polite about it. In 1865, colleagues tricked Semmelweis into visiting a mental asylum. Once inside, they committed him against his will. 2 weeks later, Semmelweis died, probably beaten by guards. He was 47 years old. It took another 20 years for his ideas to be accepted. By then, tens of thousands more women had died, including Jane Seymour, 310 years earlier, because doctors' egos were more important than women's lives. Picture this scene. October 23rd, 1537. Late at night. Jane is lying in her chamber at Hampton Court, barely conscious. The fever has her in its grip, but for just a moment she's lucid, and she can hear it through the floor, through the walls, music, laughter, the sounds of celebration. Henry is hosting another feast 3 floors below, another celebration of Edward's birth, while Jane dies above him. Can she hear the musicians playing, the courtiers dancing, the sound of Henry's booming laugh? Probably. They're celebrating the son she gave them, the son that's killing her, and nobody's coming. Nobody's checking on her. Nobody's holding her hand. Jane is alone, and she knows that she's going to die, that this fever won't break, that her body won't heal, that in a few hours she'll be gone. And Henry? Henry will mourn for exactly as long as protocol requires. Then he'll move on, find another wife, another womb, another woman to use up and discard. Does Jane want to scream, to rage, to tell them all that this isn't fair, that she did everything right, that she gave them what they wanted and it still wasn't enough? Probably. But she doesn't have the strength, so she lies there, listening to them celebrate her son, while she dies, alone. Let's talk about what happened to Jane's attendants after her death, the women who watched her die. We don't know most of their names, but we have a few letters preserved in state papers. One letter from an unnamed lady-in-waiting. The Queen's death has cast a shadow over the court. She suffered greatly in her final days. Though she bore it with Christian patience, the King is much grieved. Christian patience. Code for she was in agony, but didn't complain. Because complaining wasn't queenly. Showing pain wasn't acceptable. Jane was expected to suffer in silence, and apparently she did. Another account, possibly from Lady Rutland. Her grace grew worse each day. The physicians could do nothing. We prayed constantly, but God's will was not to spare her. God's will. Not medical negligence, not preventable infection, not Henry's indifference. God's will. It absolved everyone. The doctors who didn't wash their hands, the midwives who examined Jane repeatedly with contaminated hands, Henry, who let Jane die while he celebrated. God wanted Jane dead, so nobody was responsible. Convenient. Here's the truth about Jane Seymour. Her death wasn't a tragedy in the romantic sense. It wasn't a beautiful sacrifice. It wasn't noble or meaningful or poetic. It was brutal, preventable, unnecessary. Jane died because nobody washed their hands. Nobody understood infection. Nobody prioritized her life over Edward's. Nobody cared enough to try harder. She died because she was a woman in 1537, and women's lives didn't matter as much as the children they produced. That's the truth. Not the fairy tale about beloved Jane who Henry mourned forever. Not the myth of the devoted wife who willingly sacrificed herself. The truth? Jane was used, exploited, left to die in agony while her husband celebrated 3 floors below. And then after she was safely dead and couldn't contradict the narrative, she was turned into propaganda, the perfect wife, the true love, the martyr. It's a lie, and it's time we stopped telling it. So when you think of Jane Seymour, here's what I want you to remember. Not the serene portraits, not the myth of Henry's beloved, not the story of noble sacrifice. Remember this: a 28-year-old woman lying in a blood-soaked bed, burning with fever, crying out for help that never came. Remember the sound of celebrations echoing through the palace while she died. Remember that she did everything she was supposed to do, and it killed her anyway. Remember that her death was preventable. Remember that nobody tried hard enough to prevent it. Remember that Henry mourned her just long enough for appearances, then moved on. Remember that she's been erased, romanticized, mythologized, anything but honestly remembered. That's Jane Seymour's real story. Not a fairy tale, a horror story, and it's one that played out thousands of times across history, to women whose names we'll never know, who died in childbirth because their lives mattered less than their babies, who suffered in silence because complaining wasn't allowed, who were blamed by God, by fate, by bad luck, for deaths caused by negligence and misogyny. Jane Seymour wasn't special in her suffering. She was just the one who happened to be queen when it happened to her. So we remember her, while forgetting the thousands of others, tonight when you go to sleep in your clean bed, with your modern medicine, and your world where women aren't routinely sacrificed to dynastic ambition. Remember Jane. Remember that 487 years ago, a woman died screaming while her husband threw parties. Remember that she gave everything and received nothing. Remember that she was used up, discarded, and then rewritten as a love story. And remember, history isn't kind to women, but the truth is so much worse. Jane Seymour didn't die peacefully. She died in agony, alone, expendable. The wife Henry VIII didn't save, because he never intended to. She was always just a womb, and once she'd delivered, she was disposable. That's the truth, and it's the truth we need to remember.